O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about Gurdjieff's Christianity by Luke Behncke from Parallax Publishing, The Fourth Way's Prehistoric Teachings of Christ. And I really enjoyed this book, and I really enjoy speaking with Luke. And I think Gurdjieff is helping us see Christianity as interested in the developing of a soul. We kind of assume that we have a soul, but actually it has to be developed, and it's not assumed. And he writes on page 19, the heart of Gurdjieff's vision is the idea of developing a soul to serve the divine purpose. And that may seem abstract and may seem like it's kind of hard to imagine what that's getting at, but something I really appreciate Luke's work is this emphasis that I'll also emphasize here, where Gurdjieff wants us to really stress energy and to think energy, and how very often we've actually lost the ability to channel energy. Cleo at the net the other day mentioned that there's long traditions and shamanic practices of the idea that humans are capable of generating a unique kind of energy. But we forget it. This idea of, say, fasting. Fasting generates energy. Prayer, speaking generates energy. And it's an energy that is not reducible to food consumption or the typical ways that we think energy comes from. There's actually this entire way of life that is trying to tap into energy sources that the human can produce in themselves that have been forgotten or overlooked, as seen as impractical. And we can, I think of Gurdjieff's Christianity as wanting us to think about Christ's work as the unlocking of that energy, of mastering that energy, of being aware of that energy and energy flows, as has come out in some of my conversations with Luke. Luke made this wonderful point that energy cannot be destroyed, only channeled. It also can't be controlled, only channeled. It's a remarkable thought. An energy can go downward, inward, and become this kind of weighty thing, and then you boil up and explode, or energy can be channeled outward. And I often, in O.G. Rose, will talk about the enclosure, A is A logic as being very problematic versus an opening, a girdle point, AB. And if energy is stuck in an enclosure, it becomes auto-cannibalistic and self-destructive. But if energy can be channeled to the other, then we can start thinking more in terms of dance. We can start thinking more in terms of, what ends up also happening is as energy is released outward, feedback loops are created between us and others where more energy is generated on and on. And we've always been very concerned with the question of intrinsic motivation in belonging, again, the possibility of cultivating in people. I've spoken with Cadell about drive, and drive is very important. And I think we can actually think of a lot of what Gurdjieff is talking about alongside psychoanalytical thought. And I got into that a little bit with Luke. But this idea of humans being able to be their own drive and intrinsic motivation. And when you get around people who are so motivated, it actually can spread to others, and it can create feedback loops that are very, very powerful. And this is very tangible when it occurs. And it makes me think of this line on page 19, the soul's creation is not merely a lofty ideal, it is a real practical endeavor. I absolutely think that's the case. Belonging again to one, we'll talk about the problem of demand in economics, how we don't know how to create demand. We also seem to have stagnation occurring. We seem to have energy, people, certainly there seems to be a kind of a loss of energy that is being reflected in the meaning crisis, as Behncke says. And if we take what Gurdjieff teaches seriously, then the mental health crisis can also be seen as a crisis of energy that cannot be directed outward. It is just going inward, and that leads to mental health problems. I think taking that challenge seriously and putting it at the very, foundation of a new economy, a new society, how to tap into this energy that humans can produce and that they have within, but they tend to lose, I think is what we need to do. And the ability to socialize that energy and to share it with others seems to also be very, very important. And it should also be noted that it's not that we necessarily need everyone on planet Earth to do it. This line on page 52, Gurdjieff suggested that just 200 truly conscious people could change the world, even ending wars. I think that's a remarkable thought, and I think, again, it speaks to what we need is a critical mass of conscious people. And by conscious people, as Luke goes into in the book, and it's a very clear book, it's a very well-written book. I really appreciated how he included questions from participants from the class at Parallax. It was a very engaging read, and I would certainly suggest picking it up. But there's this idea that we just need a critical mass of people to be conscious. And conscious we can think of in line with this awareness of energy, awareness of how to make energy go outward, how to spread energy, that this can be a part of consciousness. But there's one part where he talks about how actually being an intellectual can be some of the hardest work to get an intellectual to be conscious, because they think they already are conscious because they engage in thinking. And Gurdjieff wants to stress there's a significant difference between thinking and consciousness. Just because we are thinking, that does not mean we are conscious. And there are practices in the book, one in particular to kind of bring out what it means to become conscious. And again, then there's this idea that the more conscious we are, the more we actually can energy produce and tap into these energies that are so important. Is Luke asks us to try to be really conscious of the top of our head, like to really try to situate our consciousness there, then in our toe, then in our finger. And the book will go through this a lot better than I can, but it's very interesting when you actually try to do that and you actually try to follow this practice. You go, oh my goodness, I'm hardly ever conscious of my elbow. I'm hardly ever conscious of my ear. I'm mostly just thinking. I'm hardly conscious of myself at all. And Gurdjieff wants to suggest to us a need to try to be conscious of our whole body all at once. And that may seem impossible, but there is something about doing this impossibility or attempting this impossibility that truly does unlock consciousness, and that unlocks energy that otherwise we can't tap into. And as we're discussing energy, I can't help but think the great Thomas Jockin has been doing work on health and virtue, and health as the gateway to metaphysics. And I've been thinking a lot about his work as I've been thinking in reading Luke's work on Gurdjieff. Because there's a way in which Gurdjieff is suggesting that we are not healthy today. We can't be healthy unless we're conscious, similar to how we can't be healthy unless we're virtuous, as Jockin is getting at. And unless we're healthy as such, we don't meet the conditions by which to experience the metaphysics of reality. So then it makes sense that we don't think metaphysics exist or are real. Likewise, the energy that Gurdjieff is talking about, or the modes of consciousness, or higher being, higher body being, these things seem like they don't exist. Well, of course, because we don't meet the conditions to perceive them. So relative to our scope, they don't exist. And that's a kind of form of damnation. Page 70, I love this. Faith becomes the ability to see beyond the obvious, to sense those forces and patterns shaping our lives, much like recognizing an old friend in a crowd. I really like this line, and again, it makes me think of Jockin's work on if we don't have health, which we can't have without virtue, then we lose the ability to perceive patterns in reality. We lose the ability to perceive what reality even is. And I think Gurdjieff is getting at something very similar. If we're not conscious, then we can't experience reality. If we don't have the energies that Gurdjieff is describing, then again, we can't experience reality. And Gurdjieff will situate his work as tied to a ecological message, an environmental message. Because there's this kind of idea that it is the duty, it is the role of the human being to work the energies, to know how to flow with energies, how to participate in flows and to move energies. And if we fail to do this, there's a way in which we fail to be human. We fail our duty as caretakers of the garden, as God made Adam and Eve. And we really do very rarely think about all the kinds of energy that are constantly surrounding us. It makes me think of Cleo was talking about the magnetic field around planet Earth and how rarely we think about that. And yeah, we do rarely think about that. And how much different our being might be if we took it seriously. And I like this part on page 89 to help kind of understand the sort of transformation that Gurdjieff is getting in, to quote the book. The shift is a change in one state of being, which in scientific terms is similar to the different states of matter, liquid, solid, gas, and plasma. The transition from one state of being to another represents a change in the degree of freedom within the system, and in this case, within the individual's consciousness. I find this very interesting because I thought this was a wonderful line because it suggests the kind of transformation we're talking about is that radical. When a liquid becomes a gas, that's a very profound transformation that happens. And likewise, if we learn to become conscious and tap into these energies, the kind of transformation that occurs us is very, very profound. And, we did so much work on Thus Spoke Zarathustra at Philosophy Portal. This does make me think of also Nietzsche, the kind of energy, the kind of dance, a dancing star, this sort of liveliness that Nietzsche is putting forth. That is there's that idea that the difference between a man in an Ubermess is kind of like the difference between an ape and a man. It's just this radical transformation. There might be more similarity between an ape and a man than a man in an Ubermess. Now, in an Overman. Now, I think a lot more has to be said about what Nietzsche is getting at with that. And in fact, if we think of Nietzsche as a critic of beastocentrism, as I like to call it, then we can think of all of those means of bestowing value upon us, and I have to get into this, it's in the paper that was released with Abyssal Arrows. All of those can be seen as, beastocentrism can be seen as blocking energy flow. It blocks the movement of energy, and that's one of the reasons why it hinders our development so profoundly. I think also we see in Gurdjieff a stress on encounter, on surprise, on the ability to improvise, to work with. And that for me aligns with the distinction between preparing and planning from Ivan Illich. Today we need to be prepared more than plan. This line on 115, I think, kind of suggests this. It emerges in this consciousness, this higher being, body being. It emerges at this meeting place, this point of struggle, allowing something new to happen. There has to be a certain tension, like the tension of trying to be conscious of your whole body at once. That's when something new can happen. If there's no tension, if there's no difficulty, nothing new can happen, because there's a way in which the feeling of difficulty is the feeling of consciousness. Like consciousness, it's interesting because there's something in consciousness that seeks to be asleep, seeks to be unconscious, seeks to not be present. And yet we become conscious in an error. As Alex, it's kind of like, Alex Ebert will talk about this very well, is the brain wants to save energy. So it doesn't really want to think. It wants to be automatic. It wants to become, it wants to sleep, as Gurdjieff would put it. It doesn't want to be awake. To be conscious, therefore, is going to feel hard. It's going to feel like a mistake. And yet, if we don't feel that mistake, we are asleep. And so we have to go through difficulty. And that makes me think this need for difficulty. Gurdjieff will also talk about how God made a perfect universe without any evil or any trouble in the beginning, and it fell apart. It didn't work because it didn't have a way to sustain itself. The original law of perfect order could not sustain itself in the long run, so God introduced new mechanisms to renew possibilities, from page 138. I think there is something to be said about a state of being that is achieved through struggle, that learns how to be conscious and to work energy that is greater than a state of being that is, quote-unquote, perfect without any struggle. And there's a suggestion here that option of a perfection without struggle isn't even actually possible, because it requires, there has to be a mechanism of sustaining. There has to be a mechanism of creating new energy, and it precisely is difficulty that does that. We might associate this with this idea in Hegel that it is the contradiction that moves forward thought. It is the contradiction that generates being, that if there is no contradiction, there is nothing. And so there has to be a certain difficulty, a certain contradiction, or else there is nothing. And I think Gurdjieff is pointing to something similar in that sense. And that also what Gurdjieff is interested in is to create the conditions that allow sacred conscience to surface. That it doesn't just surface magically, that there are certain, it doesn't just surface automatically. There are certain conditions that have to be met so this might occur. And what Gurdjieff is pointing to is those conditions that we can work to meet. And then then we can have energy, we can have consciousness, we can bring forth a higher body being. I like also a lot when Luke talks about attention, Gurdjieff talks about attention, and how a lot of what Gurdjieff is striving toward is for us to maintain attention and to keep our attention and to not lose it. And the system is pulling out our attention. And if we lose attention, then also we're very likely to be, to explode, to be bombs, because we have no control of our energy. Therefore, the energy will go inward and it will erupt. The system, regarding the system, Luke writes, the energy of attention is literally pulled out of our body and goes somewhere. Energy, like attention, just like energy, cannot be, it has to be channeled. It cannot be destroyed. If we're not using it, then it's probably being used against us. And so we need to actually learn how to maintain attention. Well, how do you do that? Well, by learning how to be conscious. Attention and conscious go together, but it also requires great energy to maintain attention. And so we can kind of see how these things go together: conscious, energy, and attention. Without energy, consciousness can't maintain attention, but without attention, we're not conscious. And so they all have to go together. And we can see Gurdjieff's program as strongly tied to that. And we can see his understanding of Christianity as Christianity proper is in the business of maintaining and strengthening energy, conscience, and attention. And that Christ actually came for that very mission. And we can see all of Christ's teaching in terms of that, of those three. And there is a law of three in Gurdjieff that is extremely important. Now, of course, there's a great paradox because, as Luke writes on page 189, we need all of our attention to study all of our attention. So what do we do if we don't have attention? Well, we need practices. We need works that would make us realize that something is not right, especially if we don't have the capacity to perceive what is not right. And what Luke has given us is a study that goes a very long way to helping us give all of our attention to the study of all of our attention. There is much more to be said about the book. Again, you can find it on Amazon, Gurdjieff's Christianity. I very much suggest it. You can learn more about it at Parallax. And thank you so much for your time.